My name is Bert Blackmon, and this whole area, a lot of people don't realize Andrew Jackson on the way to New Orleans, going south, camped up at Montpelier, up the road here. And on the way back, he stayed long enough to build a little fort up there. And I have been told, but I have not verified it yet, that that's this house he stayed in is where he wrote his resignation to the Army to be sent to Washington, that as soon as he got back, he would be resigning. And of course, on the way to New Orleans, he didn't have a very large contingent of regular Army, but he had fought several years in this area against Indians and Spanish, and he was well known and liked by most of his men. So everywhere he paused, you would have little groups of settlers and say, "Hey, Colonel Andy, you remember me? We fought some Indians a few years." "Yeah, I remember you." "Well, me and these boys would like to tag along if we could." "Come on." And by the time he got to New Orleans, he had a pretty good army of volunteers. And probably the weirdest was when he got there, Jean Lafitte, the pirate, came to visit with him, and he says, "Colonel Jackson, I am Jean Lafitte." And he said, "Oh yeah, I've got a warrant to arrest and hang you." Well, I kind of thought that might be the case. But if we could forget about that nasty hanging business, I would like to allow my crews to join your army. He said, "Well, how many you got?" And Lafitte had several pirate ships, and all his men were pretty good fighters, and they came to an agreement. Jackson would ignore his criminal activity, and Lafitte would promise never, ever to attack any United States ship. They both honored their agreement, and the pirates joined the U.S. Army and fought at New Orleans. And of course, you know the story of how the British were defeated at Fort Boyer on the Baldwin County side, and that turned the tide of the battle and enabled the Americans to hold the Mississippi River, which probably saved the United States. Fort Mims was another of the more dramatic events, and that one was tragic. By the time Fort Mims occurred, those families up there were so intermarried that after the battle, when the heat of battle had gone down on the Indians, a lot of them started crying and saying, "Why did we do this? Those were our cousins in that fort." Highway 59 at that time was all dirt road. Matter of fact, Highway 31 was a dirt road until about 1930. And one thing I read, it said the only paved road at one time in all of Baldwin County was the street from the railroad track to the courthouse. All of 59 to Gulf Shores was a dirt trail. And he told me that when you went from Latham to Bay Minette, that was, even if you did it real quickly, it was an all-day trip. There were places where there was no bridge and you had to ford a creek. And if it had been raining, you better have plenty of stuff piled up food-wise, because you weren't going anywhere. But each of the little communities, Blackshear, Latham, Montgomery Hills, was a real little town. Now when the railroad came through, that ended all of that. Because prior to the railroad, commerce went up and down the river. Well, the railroad was quicker, and you could carry a lot more stuff on a train than a riverboat. So that pretty much killed the commerce and the passenger trade. Now, a few riverboats persisted on into the early 1900s, but they were dwindling business and the last of the breed. But in the early days, every one of those landings was a riverboat landing. And that's where the boats tied up. And if you had business upstate, you got on the riverboat, you paid your fare, and by morning you could be in Montgomery, depending on the state of the river. When the railroads came, of course, that gave my dad employment, so I can't say too much about them. The railroads had a policy of every mile, the federal government gave them, every mile gave them a section of land. And they checkerboarded it up and down the tracks. One section will be on the west side, the next on the east, and vice versa. Well, the railroad tried to establish a little town every 5 miles up and down the line. Now, they knew some of these towns would never make it, but they reasoned some would, and those towns would provide industry which the railroad could service and make more money. And it worked pretty well. Now, coming into Baldwin County, you had Perdita at the north. Then you had the town of Kearney, which no longer exists. And then coming on south from Kearney, you had Bay Minette. And the first reference I can find to Bay Minette was in 1862 in the Civil War. G.B. Hall, who I believe at that point in time may have been county sheriff, was trying to organize a Confederate militia company, and he complained that the men that lived in Bay Minette just would not volunteer, and they were going to have to be drafted, but you'll have to do it in the middle of the night because they'll run and hide. And when you left Bay Minette, the original railroad was called the Fort Morgan Branch, and the idea was to run it straight south and then turn and go to Fort Morgan. There was no intercoastal canal at that time, so that was not an impediment. They got down there, and when they were about to go through what's now Silver Hill, those farmers flat would not sell a right-of-way. They would not do it, and man, they raised Cain, and some of them were influential enough that the state did not use eminent domain on them. So the railroad made a crook and went through what's now Robertsdale. And it established the towns of Stapleton, Loxley, Robertsdale, Foley. Gulf Shores was not even a town at that point. Nobody wanted, why settle there? It's nothing but sand. You can't grow beans or potatoes or anything down there. Few fishermen lived out towards what's now Fort Morgan. That was about it. But the railroad there was to take a 90-degree to the west and run on out to the fort. Well, they started building the line from Fort Morgan back and from Bay Minette south. Now, Bay Minette was a junction. That made it very important. One branch went on down to the Tensas River and eventually crossed the river. Now, that part of the railroad was finished in 1862. Well, the railroad itself, it took some coercion and special law from the state legislature and authorizations, but they got it finished. And you could ride a train all the way to the Tensas River, where they would put the cars on barges, carry it across, run them off on the Mobile side, and you could run all the way across to New Orleans or through Mississippi. General Bragg, well, I'm not going to be too critical of him. Let us say he was extremely lacking as a combat officer. But he was trained as an engineer, and he was extremely good at that. After the war, that's how he made his living. And he immediately recognized the value of that railroad, and he used it frequently to move troops, and he said that railroad line was good for having several extra brigades at each end because of the speed with which you could move an army. The Confederacy recognized that real quick. The Union was a little slower to do so. But the railroad completely changed the character of Baldwin County. Bay Minette became important because it was a junction, and it also sits on a plateau, which is exceedingly good for farming because the land is reasonably flat. Stockton, prior to the railroad, was a very large, thriving town. It had several hotels, a few, let's be polite, establishment that gentlemen would probably like to attend more. And it still has a city charter, but the main part of Stockton was not then where it is now. It was closer to the river, but the charter is still in effect. And during the war, the county seat was Blakely. Unfortunately, it was a ghost town even then. The only thing there was the courthouse. And so there were just almost nobody left living in Blakely. After the war, they're going to move it from Blakely to Daphne. If you go to Blakely, they have unearthed the foundation of the old courthouse, and you can see the floor of it. It's still there. And there's one photograph that shows a wall of the courthouse. But other than that, we don't have anything other than descriptions of it. I've always enjoyed historic research, which is why I do a lot of the talks to the county. I work for Bicentennial Park, and 90% of what I do is mow grass 3.5 days a week. I've retired 2 times. I did not want another career. This is perfect. I love what I do, and it's a wonderful place to work. It's beautiful up here. If you haven't been up here, you need to come see it. And it's pleasant people to work with. And when I get out on my little mower, I'm in my own world. I plug up my phone. I listen to my history lectures, or I listen to my oldies and my doo-wops on my phone, and I just mow the grass for 8 solid hours a day, and it's basically a wonderful life. My wife is still teaching, and she's going to retire in about another year or so. We do a little bit of traveling. I go to various club conventions, and we make vacations of that. We try to go up to mother's relatives, people's home in the mountains of Virginia once a year. That's a beautiful place. So my life is going well, and I really guess that's pretty much all I have to say. So in my immortal closing, I'm through talking now.